class of the Ancient and Modern Scientists and Inventors series. This class is based off the book Lego Chain Reactions, or perhaps is better described as we use the book Lego Chain Reactions to help us think about the scientists and inventors who made many of the things that we now use in our everyday life. This is made for the Helping Hands 4-H, and all of this material is taken off the internet and is available for free. So let's begin our final class. In this class, just to review, in case this is your first time, we build a couple of buildings from our Klutz manual. We draw a conclusion about inventing, or you draw a conclusion about inventing. I teach you about 3 inventors, and you find an inventor to emulate as you work on the part of the discovery and invention process that I am talking about today. As it's the final class, we're actually going to talk about something really interesting that you may not have thought about before, called presentation and the elevator pitch. So through the entire class, we have talked about the process of inventing. We learned that documentation is the most important part in beginning your process. You have to have good documentation. You have to have notes and thoughts and write down things because you're going to need to reference your own work and other people's work. And that's how you begin the process. And once you figure out how you want to document, you can look at the different parts of the processes in your documentation that you want to work on. And in weeks 2, 3, and 4, we talked about different ways you could observe a process and work towards improving it as you would work towards improving an invention. When you do this, you can note changes in processes that already exist, which will help you create wonderful inventions that are incredibly useful. As you have seen, most of the more incredible things that have been invented weren't completely thought from scratch, but were based on other inventors' works beforehand. So when we finally figure out what we have in this really great invention, we have to be able to sell our idea. This idea is called an elevator pitch. An elevator pitch is a brief, persuasive speech that you use to spark interest in what your invention does. You can use it to create buzz and talk about your product or idea, or even yourself. Maybe there's something you invented that is about you. A good elevator pitch should last no longer than a short elevator ride, so about 20 to 30 seconds, which is how you get the name elevator pitch. It should be interesting, memorable, and very, very brief. You guys have all told me great things, and sometimes we have to work to figure out what the most important part of that invention or discovery was. And that is a really important skill. And you also need to explain what makes your organization or your idea, your business, if you are going to create a business around it, or just your product, or just the idea itself, unique. Why should somebody pay attention and why is it special? So getting into the inventors we're going to talk about today, the first inventor is called Kai Lun. He is from the Eastern Han Dynasty and is a Chinese inventor and was an official of the court. He is regarded as the inventor of the modern paper making process and the inventor of modern paper. Before Kowloon, there was paper, but it was mostly woven together strips, as in papyrus, or different forms that weren't as stable, useful, or dependable. Early forms of paper had existed 2 centuries BCE, but they weren't very good. He saw paper and added important new improvements. His contributions have been so impactful on human history that he is considered one of the creator of one of the four great inventions of China, which is compass, gunpowder, paper making, and printing. Of all of these, Kai is the only one who we know the name of. So here's a little bit about paper making if you aren't aware.
History of paper. Do you know where does paper come from? How is it made? Well, the term paper comes from the word papyrus. Egyptians invented paper by pressing papyrus strips together. In ancient China, the paper makers made thick, coarse sheets of paper by mixing finely chopped mulberry bark and hemp rags with water, mashing it flat, and then pressing out the water and letting it dry in the sun. Today, wood chips are boiled with caustic soda or another chemical to soften them and strip them of everything but their long stringy fibers in a paper making machine. This pulp is spread over a conveyor belt, blasted with air, then squeezed between rollers to turn it into dry papers. Papers are used to make cartons, furnishings, to mop up liquids, etc. Paper can also be recycled to make newspapers and toilet rolls.
So that's a really brief example, and there's a lot of good um, information on YouTube about how to make your own paper or recycled paper if you are interested. So many of the legends exist on how Kyle thought of this, and one being that Kai was inspired by watching paper wasps make their nest. Um, and as the video referred to, before Kai Lun had created this new method of making paper, paper was made by weaving fibers and pounding them. So it was a very inefficient process. You had to have uh, special plants to do this. And when Kylun observed the paper wasps and how they took the fibers and combined them with liquid and built them up over layers, he realized that nests were durable, they were light, they had many of the important parts that um, generally paper did not have. And one of the things that Kai Lun was able to do was he didn't just run out and say, "Hey guys, you know those horrible insects that will sting you so hard you want to die because you get within 30 feet of them? Yeah, let's do what they're doing." No, he came up with a way to explain his idea to other people that really made sense. So when we talk about presenting, it's important to present because people need to understand what we're talking about and not focus on the wrong thing. So, when you constructed the funnel and the ramp, you can experiment with the ball and angle. So, this is project 9 of 10 in your book. Depending on where you are in the cycle, the ball could be, you know, around the corner, it can be up, it can be low. You might be able to get the ball to round several times around the bend. Um, this paper making cycle, we can see there are two ways of making paper. So as you're experimenting, you can rotate your ball clockwise, you can rotate it counterclockwise, you can adjust the angle, and you all get to the same point. You all construct a funnel that uses the ball. In the paper making process, we actually can almost see the two different funnels. Um, the two different funnels that we have are from plantation, which is trees, bamboo, other plant-based materials or cotton, and it becomes to the paper machining process. Or we can actually take spent paper and create more paper. As the video referred to, recycled paper is of an inferior quality to paper made from fresh materials. So recycled paper often gets used for things like newspaper, and it gets bleached and used for things like toilet paper. The process of paper making is something that we're discovering new things about every day. As I mentioned before, bamboo is being used, and it's a really great material because bamboo grows very fast. It's very plentiful. There's other things about paper that we're discovering, like recycling cloth into paper and how we can really get good quality paper out of recycled cloth, where we can't always get good quality paper out of recycled paper. So there's a lot of things we're still discovering. So always something. If this fascinates you, try to make some paper and see how it goes. Our next scientist is George Washington Carver. Before Carver's time, southern farmers grew very, very few other plants other than cotton. And cotton is a plant that is very, very hard on the soil. It takes a lot of nutrients up. George Washington Carver knew this and knew that the crop was failing, and he tried to get them to switch to peanuts and soybeans because these plants are legumes, and legumes added nitrogen to the soil, and that would renew the soil so you could have better crops of cotton or other materials. So not only that, in order to make this more viable, you have to have those soybeans and peanuts able to do something productive. So Carver tried to figure out things that you could do if you're growing acres and acres and acres of peanuts and soybeans. He discovered over 300 products from peanuts. He also took an interest in sweet potatoes and developed more than 100 products based on sweet potatoes. So he developed almost 1,000 products for food, um, industrial, and commercial products from peanuts, including milk, Worcestershire sauce, punches, cooking oils, salad oil, paper, cosmetics, soap, and even wood stains. He experimented with peanut based medicines um, such as antiseptics, laxatives, and goiter medicine. Um, it should be noted that these suggestions or discoveries remained curiosity and didn't find widespread application in his time. However, a lot of the notes, see that? The notes and the information that he wrote are currently being used in modern research. So while it didn't do much when he was inventing, the discoveries he made are still important to today. And just as a quick aside, he did not invent peanut butter as people commonly think. When we looked at the ramps we created for lesson 10, we needed to think and change and think and change and go through this whole process of adjusting these ramps. And if you were really adventurous, you could have even used Legos and cut out a piece of paper and made your own ramp to make it higher. I would encourage you to try to use a light cardboard like a cereal box and see how many ramps and levels you can make, or experiment with the length of your runs and the pitch, because sometimes small differences, as Carver discovered, can make a huge difference. Carver's most successful things were ones that he was able to talk about because not all of his products were commercially viable. The ones we do know were the ones that could get quick attention. Um, so Do you think in your inventions that you can create a quick pitch? Having 300 really amazing inventions may not be very useful if you can't communicate what those inventions do and why they're important or discoveries. And so that's something to think about as you process and do your work. So that is on George Washington Carver. So our last scientist here is Robert Goddard. And Robert Goddard is a little less modern than most of the modern ones we've been talking about because he's already died. He lived in 1882 to 1945. He is considered the father of modern rocket propulsion, and he's a physicist. Goddard had a unique genius for invention. He is probably the most brilliant scientist in memory as attributed by NASA. And the Goddard's Space Flight Center was built in 1959. Um, so basically, NASA also considers him one of the most brilliant men who's worked in their program. Um, Goddard, in 1926, Goddard constructed and successfully tested the first rocket using liquid fuel. The flight in actually happened in Auburn, Massachusetts, so not far from us, and was probably as significant as the Wright brothers' flight at Kitty Hawk. They were. It was a primitive flight. It wasn't anything amazing at the time. Um, and it didn't actually make a big impression on the officials at the time. They didn't think it was a big deal. They thought this was just another thing, another little improvement, and they didn't realize how significant having liquid fuel would be. So he invented many things, or worked on many things. He explored the practicality of using rocket propulsion to reach the moon in 1912. He proved a rocket will work in a vacuum, that it needs no air to push against. And if you remember our first class, if you took our first class, we talked about force and how the different forces work together. Now, one of the major things that those calculations were based on were mass and density and gravity. And they had to prove that they could do all of these things without the um, standard forces that we know. So that was a really, really new concept to everybody in the vacuum of space, where there is no gravity and there's completely different forces at work. He developed and fired the first liquid fueled rocket. He shot the first scientific payload into flight. He developed a gyro controlling apparatus for rocket flight, and he developed sustainable pumps for the fuel of the rocket fuel. One of the things that was actually most important, and this is going to sound bad, was that he died. Because Robert Goddard wasn't actually good at talking about his work, but his wife, after he died, actually was able to talk about his work, kind of sell his work, get people interested, and he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Congress in 1959, about 15 years after he died. So his widow actually was able to explain everything he did and why it was so important. And on March 16th, 1961, 35 years to the day after he had launched his liquid fuel rocket, they launched their rocket. Um, so it took a long time for his really amazing invention to be recognized. Goddard was the first scientist who not only recognized the possibilities of missiles and spaceflight, but also he directly contributed to them, bringing them into realization. We have talked about inventors who had really great ideas, but they never really made a working prototype. So we talked about helicopters, tanks, all these really cool machinery that the inventors fully and completely understood the process, but they didn't either have enough manpower or other types of things to get them in the air. We talked about Charles Babbage, who basically invented the first computing system, but it was so huge that it was impractical and he never built it. So Goddard is an interesting inventor from our perspective because he not only thought of this and made the notes and figured out all the math, but he actually did the work too. Um, and he pretty much was unknown until people started getting interested in space. So, why does it matter? Well, Goddard was a great inventor who had a really hard time expressing himself. People didn't understand why he was doing these things, and they didn't understand why it was so important. He was actually dead before the most important parts of his invention and his work got noticed, and it was because his wife had the ability to express those ideas. And it substantially impacted his ability to progress. One of the things that we learned about with some of the modern scientists is that they're working together, and that they're working together really changes the outcome of what they're doing and really can create some interesting buzz. These scientists who are currently working on projects are doing great things within the scientific community. Goddard had a really hard time expressing himself, so his work was lost to the scientific community at the time, and those who have picked it up don't have the ability to ask questions that might have furthered things even more. So your ability to communicate is incredibly important to your ability to discover and your ability to have things be understood. And so as you are growing, it's important to develop your own communication style and skills so that way when you do start inventing, you are great at contributing. And I just want to say in conclusion, it's been great to work with you the past few weeks. The process of discovery looks different for everybody, and I don't expect you to be exactly like any of the scientists that we've talked about these past weeks. We've talked about 15 very important men and women who invented things from the time they were very young to the time they were very, very old. We have scientists who we talked about inventions that they made when they were 7 or 8 years old. We have scientists who made no notable um, discoveries or input until they were well into their 60s and 70s. So it's never too early or too late to be a scientist. And there's no right or wrong way to do it. Just make sure that you follow these basic examples and you'll be able to have a great time being a scientist and inventor. We'll go over how we learn by week. Week 1, we learned about documentation. It doesn't matter if you're drawing pictures, typing on a computer, or taking pictures with a camera. You need some way to document what you're doing. Week 2, we observed and noted a process. One of the things is that in inventing, everything is going to go through a process, whether it be a computer or a medicine or a food or a gadget. The week 3, we looked at a process and we attempted to isolate one variable we wanted to fix. So, for instance, I said, observe your mom doing dishes. Observe and not talk. And then take notes and figure out one thing that you would improve in week 3. In week 4, we told you to practice this and see if this was an actual improvement and talk about your experience after the fact. Again, you're doing this without bothering the person who you observed because you want to make sure that if you find something that you think is more practical, you're able to duplicate it and replicate it and figure it out before you present your conclusion. And so the final idea is to see if you can present your conclusion and work with the people that you observed. So if you found a solution in washing the dishes that you think is a better idea, maybe you face the plates the other way and they got cleaner. Then you need to figure out and talk and see if this is actually improving. Maybe facing the plates the other way creates a different problem. So make sure as you're inventing and fixing your situation or your process of inventing, you work with the people around you and don't make any quick judgments. And when you're ready to present your conclusion, you can present your final conclusion. So, in short, begin documenting. Figure out your process. Isolate your variables. Try your fix. Sell your idea, and then begin again. I hope you had a great class. We're going to think of some more Lego things to do. The next class may be Legos around the world and talking about different things that we are doing. All right, you have a great night.